The latest is that little animals never before seen are swimming about in a glass of water. They say syphilis is a completely normal disease and no longer the punishment of God. God didn't make the world in 7 days, it said, but over millions of years, if it was he at all. Savages are human beings like us. We raise our children wrong, and the earth is no longer round like it was, but flat on the top and bottom like a melon, as if that made a damn bit of difference. In every field, people question and bore and scrutinize and pry and dabble with experiments. It's no longer enough for a man to say that something is so or how it is so. Everything now has to be proven besides, preferably with witnesses and numbers and one or another of these ridiculous experiments. These Diderots and d'Alemberts and Voltaires and Rousseaus, or whatever names these scribblers have, there are even clerics among them, and gentlemen of noble birth. They finally managed to infect the whole society with their perfidious fidgets, with their sheer delight in discontent, and their unwillingness to be satisfied with anything in this world. In short, with the boundless chaos that reigns inside their own heads. Wherever you looked, hectic excitement, people reading books, even women, priests dawdling in coffee-houses, and if the police intervened and stuck one of the chief scoundrels in prison, publishers howled and submitted petitions. Ladies and gentlemen of the highest rank used their influence, and within a couple of weeks he was set free or allowed out of the country, from where he went right on with his unconscionable pamphleteering. In the salons, people chattered about nothing but the orbits of comets and expeditions, about leverage and Newton, about building canals, the circulation of the blood, and the diameter of the earth. The king himself had had them demonstrate some sort of new-fangled nonsense, a kind of artificial thunderstorm they called electricity. With the whole court looking on, some fellow rubbed a bottle, and it gave off a spark, and His Majesty, so it was said, appeared deeply impressed. Unthinkable that his great-grandfather, the truly great Louis, under whose beneficent reign Baldini had been lucky enough to have lived for many years, would have allowed such a ridiculous demonstration in his presence. But that was the temper of the times, and it would all come to a bad end. When, without the least embarrassment, people could brazenly call into question the authority of God's church, when they could speak of the monarchy, equally a creature of God's grace, and the sacred person of the king himself, as if they were both simply interchangeable items in a catalogue of various forms of government to be selected on a whim, when they had the ultimate audacity, and have it they did, to describe God himself, the Almighty, very God of very God, as dispensable, and to maintain in all earnestness that order, morals, and happiness on this earth could be conceived of without him, purely as matters of man's inherent morality and reason. God! Good God! Then you needn't wonder that everything was turned upside down, that morals had degenerated, and that humankind had brought down upon itself the judgment of him whom it denied. It would come to a bad end. The great comet of 1681, they had mocked it, calling it a mere clump of stars, while in truth it was an omen sent by God in warning, for it had portended, as was clear by now, a century of decline and disintegration, ending in the spiritual, political, and religious quagmire that man had created for himself, into which he would one day sink, and where only glossy, stinking swamp flowers flourished, like Pelissier himself. Baldini stood at the window, an old man, and gazed malevolently at the sun angled above the river. Barges emerged beneath him and slid slowly to the west, toward the Pont Neuf and the quay below the galleries of the Louvre. No one poled barges against the current here. For that they used the channel on the other side of the island. Here everything flowed away from you. The empty and the heavily laden ships, the rowboats and the flat-bottomed punts of the fishermen, the dirty brown and the golden-curled water, everything flowed away, slowly, broadly, and inevitably. And if Baldini looked directly below him, straight down the wall, It seemed to him as if the flowing water were sucking the foundations of the bridge with it, and he grew dizzy. He had made a mistake buying a house on the bridge, and a second when he selected one on the western side, because constantly before his eyes now was a river flowing from him, and it was as if he himself and his house and the wealth he had accumulated over many decades were flowing away like the river, while he was too old and weak to oppose the powerful current. Sometimes, when he had business on the left bank, in the quarter of the Sorbonne or around Saint-Sulpice, he would not walk across the island and the Pont Saint-Michel, but would take the longer way across the Pont Neuf, for it was a bridge without buildings, and then he would stand at the eastern parapet and gaze up the river, just for once to see everything flowing toward him, and for a few moments he basked in the notion that his life had been turned around, that his business was prospering, his family thriving, that women threw themselves at him, that his own life, instead of dwindling away, was growing and growing. But then, if he lifted his gaze the least bit, he could see his own house, tall and spindly and fragile, several 100 yards away on the Pont au Change, and he saw the window of his study on the second floor, and saw himself standing there at the window, saw himself looking out at the river and watching the water flow away, just as now. And then the beautiful dream would vanish, and Baldini would turn away from where he had stood on the Pont Neuf, more despondent than before, as despondent as he was now, turning away from the window and taking his seat at his desk. 12. Before him stood the flacon with Pellissier's perfume. Glistening golden brown in the sunlight, the liquid was clear, not clouded in the least. It looked totally innocent, like a light tea, and yet contained, in addition to 4/5 alcohol, 1/5 of a mysterious mixture that could set a whole city trembling with excitement. The mixture, moreover, might consist of 3 or 30 different ingredients, prepared from among countless possibilities in very precise proportions to one another. It was the soul of the perfume, if one could speak of a perfume made by this ice-cold profiteer Pellissier as having a soul, and the task now was to discover its composition. Baldini blew his nose carefully and pulled down the blind at the window, since direct sunlight was harmful to every artificial scent or refined concentration of odours. He pulled a fresh white lace handkerchief out of a desk drawer and unfolded it. Then, holding his head far back and pinching his nostrils together, he opened the flacon with a gentle turn of the stopper. He did not want, for God's sake, to get a premature olfactory sensation directly from the bottle. Perfume must be smelled in its efflorescent, gaseous state, never as a concentrate. He sprinkled a few drops onto the handkerchief, waved it in the air to drive off the alcohol, and then held it to his nose. In 3 short, jerky tugs, he snatched up the scent as if it were a powder, immediately blew it out again, fanned himself, took another sniff in waltz time, and finally drew one long, deep breath, which he then exhaled slowly, with several pauses, as if letting it slide down a long, gently sloping staircase. He tossed the handkerchief onto his desk and fell back into his armchair. The perfume was disgustingly good. That miserable Pellissier was unfortunately a virtuoso, a master, to heaven's shame, even if he had never learned one thing 1,000 times over. Baldini wished he had created it himself, this Amor and Psyche. There was nothing common about it, an absolute classic, full and harmonious, and for all that, fascinatingly new. It was fresh, but not frenetic. It was floral, without being unctuous. It possessed depth, a splendid, abiding, voluptuous, rich brown depth, and yet was not in the least excessive or bombastic. Baldini stood up almost in reverence, and held the handkerchief under his nose once again. "Wonderful, wonderful," he murmured, sniffing greedily. "It has a cheerful character. It's charming. It's like a melody. Puts you in a good mood at once. What nonsense, a good mood." And he flung the handkerchief back onto his desk in anger, turned away, and walked to the farthest corner of the room, as if ashamed of his enthusiasm. Ridiculous! Letting himself be swept up in such eulogies. Like a melody, cheerful, wonderful, good mood. How idiotic, childishly idiotic, a moment's impression, an old weakness, a matter of temperament, most likely his Italian blood. Judge not as long as you're smelling. That is rule number 1, Baldini, you muttonhead. Smell when you're smelling, and judge after you have smelled. Amor and Psyche is not half bad as a perfume, a thoroughly successful product, a cleverly managed bit of concocting, if not to say conjuring. And you could expect nothing but conjuring from a man like Pélissier. Of course, a fellow like Pélissier would not manufacture some hackneyed perfume. The scoundrel conjured with complete mastery of his art, confusing your sense of smell with its perfect harmony. In the classical arts of scent, the man was a wolf in sheep's clothing. In short, he was a monster with talent, and what was worse, a perverter of the true faith. But you, Baldini, are not going to be fooled. You were surprised for a moment by your first impression of this concoction. But do you know how it will smell an hour from now, when its volatile ingredients have fled and the central structure emerges? Or how it will smell this evening, when all that is still perceptible are the heavy, dark components that now lie in odorous twilight beneath a veil of flowers? Wait and see, Baldini. The second rule is, perfume lives in time. It has its youth, its maturity, and its old age, and only if it gives off a scent equally pleasant at all 3 different stages of its life can it be called successful. How often have we not discovered that a mixture that smelled delightfully fresh when first tested, after a brief interval was more like rotten fruit, and finally reeked of nothing but the pure civet we had used too much of. Utmost caution with the civet. 1 drop too much brings catastrophe, an old source of error. Who knows? Perhaps Pélissier got carried away with the civet. Perhaps by this evening all that's left of his ambitious Amor and Psyche will be just a whiff of cat piss. We shall see. We shall smell it. Just as a sharp axe can split a log into tiny splinters, our nose will fragment every detail of this perfume, and then it will be only too apparent that this ostensibly magical scent was created by the most ordinary, familiar methods. We, Baldini, perfumer, shall catch Pélissier, the vinegar man, at his tricks. We shall rip the mask from his ugly face and show the innovator just what the old craft is capable of. We'll scrupulously imitate his mixture, his fashionable perfume. It will be born anew in our hands, so perfectly copied that the humbug himself won't be able to tell it from his own. No, that's not enough. We shall improve on it. We'll show up his mistakes and rinse them away, and then rub his nose in it. You're a bungler, Pélissier. An old stinker is what you are. An upstart in the craft of perfumery, and nothing more. And now to work, Baldini. Sharpen your nose and smell, without sentimentality. Dissect the scent by the rules of the art. You must have the formula by this evening. And he made a dive for his desk, grabbing paper, ink, and a fresh handkerchief, laid it all out properly, and began his analysis. The procedure was this: to dip the handkerchief in the perfume, pass it rapidly under his nose, and extract from the fleeting cloud of scent one or another of its ingredients, without being significantly distracted by the complex blending of its other parts. Then, holding the handkerchief at the end of his outstretched arm, to jot down the name of the ingredient he had discovered, and repeat the process at once, letting the handkerchief flit by his nose, snatching at the next fragment of scent, and so on. 13. He worked without pause for 2 hours, with increasingly hectic movements, increasingly shipshod scribblings of his pen on the paper, and increasingly large doses of perfume sprinkled onto his handkerchief and held to his nose. He could hardly smell anything now. The volatile substances he was inhaling had long since drugged him. He could no longer recognize what he thought had been established beyond doubt at the start of his analysis. He knew that it was pointless to continue smelling. He would never ascertain the ingredients of this new-fangled perfume, certainly not today, not tomorrow either, when his nose would have recovered, God willing. He had never learned fractionary smelling. Dissecting scents, fragmenting a unity, whether well or not so well blended, into its simple components was a wretched, loathsome business. It did not interest him. He did not want to continue. But his hand automatically kept on making the dainty motion, practised 1,000 times over, of dunking the handkerchief, shaking it out, and whisking it rapidly past his face. And with each whisk he automatically snapped up a portion of scent-drenched air, only to let it out again with the proper exhalations and pauses, until finally his own nose liberated him from the torture, swelling in allergic reaction till it was stopped up as tight as if plugged with wax. He could not smell a thing now, could hardly breathe. It was as if a bad cold had soldered his nose shut. Little tears gathered in the corners of his eyes. Thank God in heaven! Now he could quit in good conscience. He had done his duty to the best of his abilities, according to all the rules of the art, and was, as so often before, defeated. Ultra posse nemo obligatur. Closing time. Tomorrow morning he would send off to Pellissier's for a large bottle of Amor and Psyche, and use it to scent the Spanish hide for Count Veramont, as per order. And after that he would take his valise, full of old-fashioned soaps, scent-bags, pomades, and sachets, and make his rounds among the salons of doddering countesses. And one day the last doddering countess would be dead, and with her his last customer. By then he would himself be doddering, and would have to sell his business to Pellissier or another one of these upstart merchants. Perhaps he would get a few thousand livres for it. And he would pack 1 or 2 bags, and go off to Italy with his old wife, if she was not dead herself by then. And if he survived the trip, he would buy a little house in the country near Messina, where things were cheap. And there, in the bitterest poverty, he, Giuseppe Baldini, once the greatest perfumer of Paris, would die, whenever God willed it. And that was well and good. He stoppered the flacon, laid down his pen, and wiped the drenched handkerchief across his forehead one last time. He could sense the cooling effect of the evaporating alcohol, but nothing else. Then the sun went down. Baldini stood up. He opened the jalousie, and his body was bathed to the knees in the sunset, caught fire like a burnt-out torch glimmering low. He saw the deep red rim of the sun behind the Louvre, and the softer fire across the slate roofs of the city. On the river, shining like gold below him, the ships had disappeared. And a wind must have come up, for gusts were serrating the surface, and it glittered, now here, now there, moving ever closer, as if a giant hand were scattering millions of louis d'or over the water. For a moment it seemed the direction of the river had changed. It was flowing toward Baldini, a shimmering flood of pure gold. Baldini's eyes were moist and sad. He stood there motionless for a long time, gazing at the splendid scene. Then, suddenly, he flung both window casements wide, and pitched the flacon with Pellissier's perfume away in a high arc. He saw it splash and rend the glittering carpet of water for an instant. Fresh air streamed into the room. Baldini gulped for breath, and noticed that the swelling in his nose was subsiding. Then he closed the window. At almost the same moment, night fell, very suddenly. The view of a glistening golden city and river turned into a rigid, ashen-grey silhouette. Inside the room, all at once, it was dark. Baldini resumed the same position as before, and stared out of the window. "I shall not send anyone to Pellicier's in the morning," he said, grasping the back of the armchair with both hands. "I shall not do it, and I shall not make my tour of the salons either. Instead, I shall go to the notary tomorrow morning and sell my house and my business. That is what I shall do. E basta." The expression on his face was that of a cheeky young boy, and he suddenly felt very happy. He was once again the old, the young Baldini, as bold and determined as ever to contend with fate, even if contending meant a retreat in this case. And what if it did? There was nothing else to do. These were stupid times, and they left him no choice. God gives good times and bad times, but he does not wish us to bemoan and bewail the bad times, but to prove ourselves men, and he had given his sign. That golden, blood-red mirage of the city had been a warning. Act now, Baldini, before it is too late. Your house still stands firm, your storage rooms are still full, you will still be able to get a good price for your slumping business. The decisions are still in your hands. To grow old living modestly in Messina had not been his goal in life, true, but it was more honourable and pleasing to God than to perish in splendour in Paris. Let the Bruets, Caltos, and Pellissiers have their triumph. Giuseppe Baldini was clearing out, but he did it unbent and of his own free will. He was quite proud of himself now, and his mind was finally at peace. For the first time in years there was an easing in his back of the subordinate's cramp that had tensed his neck and given an increasingly obsequious hunch to his shoulders. And he stood up straight without strain, relaxed and free, and pleased with himself. His breath passed lightly through his nose. He could clearly smell the scent of Amor and Psyche that reigned in the room, but he did not let it affect him any more. Baldini had changed his life, and felt wonderful. He would go up to his wife now and inform her of his decision, and then he would make a pilgrimage to Notre Dame, and light a candle, thanking God for his gracious prompting, and for having endowed him, Giuseppe Baldini, with such unbelievable strength of character. With almost youthful élan, he plopped his wig onto his bald head, slipped into his blue coat, grabbed the candlestick from the desk, and left his study. He had just lit the tallow candle in the stairwell to light his way up to his living quarters, when he heard a doorbell ring on the ground floor. It was not the Persian chimes at the shop door, but the shrill ring of the servants' entrance, a repulsive sound that had always annoyed him. He had often made up his mind to have the thing removed and replaced with a more pleasant bell, but then the cost would always seem excessive. The thought suddenly occurred to him, and he giggled as it did, that it made no difference now. He would be selling the obtrusive doorbell along with the house. Let his successor deal with the vexation. The bell rang shrilly again. He cocked his ear for sounds below. Apparently Chenier had already left the shop, and the servant girl seemed not about to answer it either, so Baldini went downstairs to open the door himself. He pulled back the bolt, swung the heavy door open, and saw nothing. The darkness completely swallowed the light of his candle. Then, very gradually, he began to make out a figure, a child or a half-grown boy, carrying something over his arm. "What do you want?" "I'm from Maître Grimal. I'm delivering the goatskins," said the figure, and stepped closer and held out to him a stack of hides hanging from his cocked arm. By the light of his candle, Baldini could now see the boy's face and his nervous, searching eyes. He carried himself hunched over. He looked as if he were hiding behind his own outstretched arm, waiting to be struck a blow. It was Grenouille. 14. The goatskins for the Spanish leather. Baldini remembered now. He had ordered the hides from Grimal a few days before, the finest, softest goatskin, to be used as a blotter for Count Véramont's desk, 15 francs apiece. But he really did not need them any more, and could spare the expense. On the other hand, if he were simply to send the boy back, who knew? It could make a bad impression. People might begin to talk. Rumours might start. Baldini is getting undependable. Baldini isn't getting any orders. Baldini can't pay his bills. And that would not be good. No, because something like that was likely to lower the selling price of his business. It would be better to accept these useless goatskins. No one needed to know ahead of time that Giuseppe Baldini had changed his life. "Come in." He let the boy inside, and they walked across to the shop, Baldini leading with the candle, Grenouille behind him with the hides. It was the first time Grenouille had ever been in a perfumery, a place in which odours are not accessories, but stand unabashedly at the centre of interest. Naturally, he knew every single perfumery and apothecary in the city, had stood for nights on end at their shop windows, his nose pressed to the cracks of their doors. He knew every single odour handled here, and had often merged them in his innermost thoughts to create the most splendid perfumes. So there was nothing new awaiting him. And yet, just as a musically gifted child burns to see an orchestra close up, or to climb into the church choir where the organ keyboard lies hidden, Grenouille burned to see a perfumery from the inside, and when he had heard that leather was to be delivered to Baldini, he had done all he could to make sure that he would be the one to deliver it. And here he stood in Baldini's shop, on the one spot in Paris with the greatest number of professional scents assembled in one small place. He could not see much in the fleeting light of the candle, only brief glimpses of the shadows thrown by the counter with its scales, the 2 herons above the vessel, an armchair for the customers, the dark cupboards along the walls, the brief flash of bronze utensils and white labels on bottles and crucibles. Nor could he smell anything beyond what he could already smell from the street. But he at once felt the seriousness that reigned in these rooms. You might almost call it a holy seriousness, if the word holy had held any meaning whatever for Grenouille. For he could feel the cold seriousness, the craftsmanlike sobriety, the staid business sense that adhered to every piece of furniture, every utensil, to tubs, bottles, and pots. And as he walked behind Baldini, in Baldini's shadow, for Baldini did not take the trouble to light his way, he was overcome by the idea that he belonged here and nowhere else, that he would stay here, that from here he would shake the world from its foundations. The idea was, of course, one of perfectly grotesque immodesty. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that could justify a stray tanner's helper of dubious origin, without connections or protection, without the least social standing, to hope that he would get so much as a toehold in the most renowned perfume shop in Paris, all the less so since we know that the decision had been made to dissolve the business. But what had formed in Grenouille's immodest thoughts was not, after all, a matter of hope, but of certainty. He knew that the only reason he would leave this shop would be to fetch his clothes from Grimal's, and then never again. The tick had scented blood. It had been dormant for years, encapsulated, and had waited. Now it let itself drop, for better or for worse, entirely without hope. And that was why he was so certain. They had crossed through the shop. Baldini opened the back room that faced the river and served partly as a storeroom, partly as a workshop and laboratory, where soaps were cooked, pomades stirred, and toilet waters blended in big-bellied bottles. "There," he said, pointing to a large table in front of the window. "Lay them there." Grenouille stepped out from Baldini's shadow, laid the leather on the table, but quickly jumped back again, placing himself between Baldini and the door. Baldini stood there for a while. He held the candle to one side to prevent the wax from dripping on the table, and stroked the smooth surface of the skins with the back of his fingers. Then he pulled back the top one and ran his hand across the velvety reverse side, rough and yet soft at the same time. They were very good goatskins, just made for Spanish leather. As they dried, they would hardly shrink, and when correctly paired, they would become supple again. He could feel that at once, just by pressing one between his thumb and index finger. They could be impregnated with scent for 5 to 10 years. They were very, very good hides. Perhaps he could make gloves from them, 3 pairs for himself and 3 for his wife, for the trip to Messina. He pulled back his hand. He was touched by the way this work-table looked. Everything lay ready, the glass basin for the perfume bath, the glass plate for drying, the mortars for mixing the tincture, pestle and spatula, brush and parer and shears. It was as if these things were only sleeping because it was dark, and would come to life in the morning. Should he perhaps take the table with him to Messina? And a few of the tools, only the most important ones. You could sit and work very nicely at this table. The boards were oak, and legs as well, and it was cross-braced, so that nothing about it could wiggle or wobble. Acids couldn't mar it, or oils, or slips of a knife. But it would cost a fortune to take it with him to Messina, even by ship. And therefore it would be sold. The table would be sold tomorrow, and everything that lay on it, under it, and beside it would be sold as well. Because he, Baldini, might have a sentimental heart, but he also had strength of character, and so he would follow through on his decision, as difficult as that was to do. He would give it all up with tears in his eyes, but he would do it none the less, because he knew he was right. He had been given a sign. He turned to go. There at the door stood this little deformed person he had almost forgotten about. "They're fine," Baldini said. "Tell your master that the skins are fine. I'll come by in the next few days and pay for them." "Yes, sir," said Grenouille, but stood where he was, blocking the way for Baldini, who was ready to leave the workshop. Baldini was somewhat startled, but so unsuspecting that he took the boy's behaviour not for insolence, but for shyness. "What is it?" he asked. "Is there something else I can do for you? Well, speak up." Grenouille stood there, cowering and gazing at Baldini, with a look of apparent timidity, but which in reality came from a cunning intensity. "I want to work for you, Maître Baldini. Work for you, here, in your business." It was not spoken as a request, but as a demand, nor was it really spoken, but squeezed out, hissed in reptile fashion. And once again Baldini misread Grenouille's outrageous self-confidence as boyish awkwardness. He gave him a friendly smile. "You're a tanner's apprentice, my lad," he said. "I have no use for a tanner's apprentice. I have a journeyman already, and I don't need an apprentice." "You want to make these goat skins smell good, Maître Baldini? You want to make this leather I've brought you smell good, don't you?" Grenouille hissed, as if he had paid not the least attention to Baldini's answer. "Yes, indeed," said Baldini. "With Amour and Psyche by Pélissier?" Grenouille asked, cowering even more than before. At that, a wave of mild terror swept through Baldini's body, not because he asked himself how this lad knew all about it so exactly, but simply because the boy had said the name of the wretched perfume that had defeated his efforts at decoding today. "How did you ever get the absurd idea that I would use someone else's perfume to—" "You reek of it," Grenouille hissed. "You have it on your forehead, and in your right coat pocket is a handkerchief soaked with it. It's not very good, this Amour and Psyche. It's bad. There's too much bergamot and too much rosemary, and not enough attar of roses." "Aha," Baldini said, totally surprised that the conversation had veered from the general to the specific. "What else?" "Orange blossom, lime, clove, musk, jasmine, alcohol, and something that I don't know the name of. There, you see, right there, in that bottle." and he pointed a finger into the darkness. Baldini held the candlestick up in that direction, his gaze following the boy's index finger toward a cupboard and falling upon a bottle filled with a greyish-yellow balm. "Storax?" he asked. Grenouille nodded. "Yes, that's in it too. Storax." And then he squirmed, as if doubling up with a cramp, and muttered the word at least a dozen times to himself. "Storax, Storax, Storax, Storax." Baldini held his candle up to this lump of humankind, wheezing Storax, and thought, either he is possessed, or a thieving impostor, or truly gifted. For it was perfectly possible that the list of ingredients, if mixed in the right proportions, could result in the perfume Amor and Psyche. It was, in fact, probable. Attar of roses, clove, and storax. It was those three ingredients that he had searched for so desperately this afternoon. Joining them with the other parts of the composition, which he believed he had recognized as well, would unite the segments into a pretty, rounded pastry. It was now only a question of the exact proportions in which you had to join them. To find that out, he, Baldini, would have to run experiments for several days, a horrible task, almost worse than the basic identification of the parts, for it meant you had to measure and weigh and record, and all the while pay damn close attention, because the least bit of inattention, a tremble of the pipette, a mistake in counting drops, could ruin the whole thing. And every botched attempt was dreadfully expensive. Every ruined mixture was worth a small fortune. He wanted to test this mannequin, wanted to ask him about the exact formula for Amor and Psyche. If he knew it to the drop and dram, then he was obviously an impostor who had somehow pinched the recipe from Pélissier in order to gain access and get a position with him, Baldini. But if he came close, then he was a genius of scent, and as such provoked Baldini's professional interest. Not that Baldini would jeopardize his firm decision to give up his business. This perfume by Pélissier was itself not the important thing to him. Even if the fellow could deliver it to him by the gallon, Baldini would not dream of scenting Count Veramont's Spanish hides with it. But he had not been a perfumer his life long, had not concerned himself his life long with the blending of scents, to have lost all professional passions from one moment to the next. Right now he was interested in finding out the formula for this damned perfume, and beyond that, in studying the gifts of this mysterious boy, who had parsed a scent right off his forehead. He simply wanted to know what was behind that. He was quite simply curious. "You have, it appears, a fine nose, young man," he said, once Grenouille had ceased his wheezings, and he stepped back into the workshop, carefully setting the candlestick on the work-table. "Without doubt, a fine nose, but—" "I have the best nose in Paris, Maître Baldini," Grenouille interrupted with a rasp. "I know all the odours in the world, all of them, only I don't know the names of some of them, but I can learn the names. The odours that have names, there aren't many of those, there are only a few thousand. I'll learn them all. I'll never forget the name of that balm, Storax. The balm is called Storax. It's called Storax." "Silence!" shouted Baldini. "Do not interrupt me when I'm speaking. You are impertinent and insolent. No one knows 1,000 odours by name. Even I don't know 1,000 of them by name. At best a few hundred, for there aren't more than a few hundred in our business. All the rest aren't odours, they are simply stenches." During the rather lengthy interruption that had burst from him, Grenouille had almost unfolded his body, had in fact been so excited for the moment that he had flailed both arms in circles to suggest the all of them that he knew. But at Baldini's reply he collapsed back into himself, like a black toad lurking there motionless on the threshold. "I have, of course, been aware," Baldini continued, "for some time now, that Amor and Psyche consisted of storax, attar of roses, and cloves, plus bergamot and extract of rosemary, etc. All that is needed to find that out is, as I said, a passably fine nose. And it may well be that God has given you a passably fine nose, as he has many, many other people as well, particularly at your age. A perfumer, however, and here Baldini raised his index finger and puffed out his chest, a perfumer, however, needs more than a passably fine nose. He needs an incorruptible, hard-working organ that has been trained to smell for many decades, enabling him to decipher even the most complicated odors by composition and proportion, as well as to create new, unknown mixtures of scent. Such a nose, and here he tapped his with his finger, is not something one has, young man. It is something one acquires by perseverance and diligence. Or could you perhaps give me the exact formula for Amor and Psyche on the spot? Well, could you? Grenouille did not answer. Could you perhaps give me a rough guess? Baldini said, bending forward a bit to get a better look at the toad at his door. Just a rough one, an estimation. Well, speak up. Best nose in Paris. But Grenouille was silent. You see, said Baldini, equally both satisfied and disappointed, and he straightened up. You can't do it. Of course you can't. You're one of those people who know whether there is chervil or parsley in the soup at mealtime. That's fine. There's something to be said for that. But that doesn't make you a cook, not by a long shot. Whatever the art or whatever the craft, and make note of this before you go, talent means next to nothing, while experience, acquired in humility and with hard work, means everything. He was reaching for the candlestick on the table, when from the doorway came Grenouille's pinched snarl, I don't know what a formula is, maître, I don't know that, but otherwise I know everything. A formula is the alpha and omega of every perfume, replied Baldini sternly, for he wanted to end this conversation now. It contains scrupulously exact instructions for the proportions needed to mix individual ingredients so that the result is the unmistakable scent one desires. That is a formula. It is the recipe, if that is a word you understand better. Formula. Formula, rasped Grenouille, and grew somewhat larger in the doorway. I don't need a formula. I have the recipe in my nose. Can I mix it for you, maître? Can I mix it? Can I? How's that? Cried Baldini in a rather loud voice, and held the candle up to the gnome's face. How would you mix it? For the first time Grenouille did not flinch. Why, they're all here, all the ones you need. The scents, they're all here, in this room, he said, pointing again into the darkness. There's attar of roses, there's orange blossom, that's clove, that's rosemary, there. Certainly they're here, roared Baldini. They are all here. But I'm telling you, you blockhead, that is of no use if one does not have the formula. There's jasmine, alcohol there, bergamot there, storax there. Grenouille went on crowing, and at each name he pointed to a different spot in the room, although it was so dark that at best you could surmise the shadows of the cupboards filled with bottles. You can see in the dark, can you? Baldini went on. You not only have the best nose, but also the keenest eyes in Paris, do you? Now, if you have passably good ears, then open them up, because I'm telling you, you are a little swindler. You probably picked up your information at Pellicier's, did some spying, is that it? And now you think you can pull the wool over my eyes, right? Grenouille was now standing up, completely unfolded to full size, so to speak, in the doorway, his legs slightly apart, his arms slightly spread, so that he looked like a black spider that had latched onto the threshold and frame. "Give me 10 minutes," he said, in close to a normal, fluent pattern of speech, "and I will produce for you the perfume Amor and Psyche. Right now, Right here in this room. Maître, give me just 5 minutes.
Do you suppose I'd let you slop around here in my laboratory with essences that are worth a fortune? You?
Yes, said Grenouille.
Bah!
Baldini shouted, exhaling all at once every bit of air he had in him. Then he took a deep breath and a long look at Grenouille the spider and thought it over. Basically, it makes no difference, he thought, because it will be all over tomorrow anyway. I know for a fact that he can't do what he claims he can't possibly do it. Why, that would make him greater than the great Frangipani. But why shouldn't I let him demonstrate before my eyes what I know to be true? It is possible that some day in Messina people do grow very strange in old age, and their minds fix on the craziest ideas. I'll get the notion that I had failed to recognize an olfactory genius, a creature upon whom the grace of God had been poured out in superabundance, a wunderkind. It's totally out of the question. Everything my reason tells me says it is out of the question. But miracles do happen, that is certain. So what if, when I lie dying in Messina some day, the thought comes to me there on my deathbed, on that evening back in Paris, I shut my eyes to a miracle. That would not be very pleasant, Baldini. Let the fool waste a few drops of attar of roses and musk tincture. You would have wasted them yourself if Pellissier's perfume had still interested you. And what are a few drops, though expensive ones, very, very expensive, compared to certain knowledge and a peaceful old age?
Now, pay attention, he said with an affectedly stern voice. Pay attention. What is your name, anyway?
Grenouille, said Grenouille. Jean-Baptiste Grenouille.
Aha, said Baldini. All right, then. Now, pay attention, Jean-Baptiste Grenouille. I have thought it over. You shall have the opportunity now, this very moment, to prove your assertion. Your grandiose failure will also be an opportunity for you to learn the virtue of humility, which, although one may pardon the total lack of its development at your tender age, will be an absolute prerequisite for later advancement as a member of your guild, and for your standing as a man of honor, a dutiful subject, and a good Christian. I am prepared to teach you this lesson at my own expense. For certain reasons, I am feeling generous this evening, and who knows, perhaps the recollection of this scene will amuse me one day. But do not suppose that you can dupe me. Giuseppe Baldini's nose is old, but it is still sharp enough immediately to recognize the slightest difference between your mixture and this product here.
And at that he pulled the handkerchief drenched in Amor and Psyche from his pocket and waved it under Grenouille's nose.
Come closer, best nose in Paris. Come here to the table and show me what you can do. But be careful not to drop anything or knock anything over. Don't touch anything yet. Let me provide some light first. We want to have lots of illumination for this little experiment, don't we? And with that he took 2 candlesticks that stood at the end of the large oak table and lit them. He placed all 3 next to one another along the back, pushed the goatskins to one side, cleared the middle of the table. Then, with a few composed yet rapid motions, he fetched from a small stand the utensils needed for the task, the big-bellied mixing bottle, the glass funnel, the pipette, the small and large measuring glasses, and placed them in proper order on the oaken surface. Grenouille had meanwhile freed himself from the door-frame. Even while Baldini was making his pompous speech, the stiffness and cunning intensity had fallen away from him. He had heard only the approval, only the yes, with the inner jubilation of a child that has sulked its way to some permission granted and thumbs its nose at the limitations, conditions, and moral admonitions tied to it. Standing there at his ease and letting the rest of Baldini's oration flow by, he was for the first time more human than animal,
because he knew that he had already conquered the man who had yielded to him. While Baldini was still fussing with his candlesticks at the table, Grenouille had already slipped off into the darkness of the laboratory, with its cupboards full of precious essences, oils, and tinctures, and following his sure-scenting nose, grabbed each of the necessary bottles from the shelves. There were 9 altogether: essence of orange blossom, lime oil, attars of rose and clove, extracts of jasmine, bergamot, and rosemary, musk tincture, and storax balm, all quickly plucked down and set at the ready on the edge of the table. The last item he lugged over was a demijohn full of high-proof rectified spirit. Then he placed himself behind Baldini, who was still arranging his mixing utensils with deliberate pedantry, moving this glass back a bit, that one over more to one side, so that everything would be in its old accustomed order and displayed to its best advantage in the candlelight, and waited, quivering with impatience, for the old man to get out of the way and make room for him.
"There," Baldini said at last, stepping aside. "I've lined up everything you'll require for, let us graciously call it, your experiment. Don't break anything, don't spill anything. Just remember, the liquids you are about to dabble in for the next 5 minutes are so precious and so rare that you will never again in all your life hold them in your hands in such concentrated form."
"How much of it shall I make for you, maître?" Grenouille asked.
"Make what?"
said Baldini, who had not yet finished his speech.
"How much of the perfume?"
rasped Grenouille.
"How much of it do you want? Shall I fill this big bottle here to the rim?"
And he pointed to a mixing bottle that held a gallon at the very least.
"No, you shall not!"
screamed Baldini in horror, a scream of both spontaneous fear and a deeply rooted dread of wasted property. Embarrassed at what his scream had revealed, he followed it up by roaring,
"And don't interrupt me when I am speaking, either!"
Then, in a calm voice tinged with irony, he continued,
"Why would we need a gallon of a perfume that neither of us thinks much of? Half a beakerful will do, really. But since such small quantities are difficult to measure, I'll allow you to start with 1/3 of a mixing bottle."
"Good," said Grenouille. "I'm going to fill 1/3 of this bottle with Amor and Psyche. But, Maître Baldini, I will do it in my own way. I don't know if it will be how a craftsman would do it. I don't know how that's done, but I will do it my own way."
"As you please," said Baldini,
who knew that in this business there was no your way or my way, but one and only one way, which consisted of knowing the formula and, using the appropriate calculations for the quantity one desired, creating a precisely measured concentrate of the various essences, which then had to be volatilized into a true perfume by mixing it in a precise ratio with alcohol, usually varying between 1 to 10 and 1 to 20. There was no other way, that he knew. And therefore what he was now called upon to witness, first with derisive hauteur, then with dismay, and finally with helpless astonishment, seemed to him nothing less than a miracle. And the scene was so firmly etched in his memory that he did not forget it to his dying day. 15. The little man named Grenouille first uncorked the demijohn of alcohol. Heaving the heavy vessel up gave him difficulty. He had to lift it almost even with his head to be on a level with the funnel that had been inserted into the mixing bottle, and to which he poured the alcohol directly from the demijohn without bothering to use a measuring glass. Baldini shuddered at such concentrated ineptitude. Not only had the fellow turned the world of perfumery upside down by starting with the solvent without having first created the concentrate to be dissolved, but he was also hardly even physically capable of the task. He was shaking with exertion, and Baldini was waiting at any moment for the heavy demijohn to come crashing down and smash everything on the table to pieces. The candles, he thought. For God's sake, the candles! There's going to be an explosion. He'll burn my house down. And he was about to lunge for the demijohn and grab it out of the madman's hands, when Grenouille set it down himself, getting it back on the floor all in one piece, and stoppered it. A clear, light liquid swayed in the bottle, not a drop spilled. For a few moments Grenouille panted for breath, but with a look of contentment on his face, as if the hardest part of the job were behind him. And indeed, what happened now proceeded with such speed that Baldini could hardly follow it with his eyes, let alone keep track of the order in which it occurred, or make even partial sense of the procedure. Grenouille grabbed, apparently at random, from the row of essences in their flacons, pulled out the glass stoppers, held the contents under his nose for an instant, splashed a bit of one bottle, dribbled a drop or two of another, poured a dash of a third into the funnel, and so on. Pipette, test tube, measuring glass, spoons and rods, all the utensils that allow the perfumer to control the complicated process of mixing, Grenouille did not so much as touch a single one of them. It was as if he were just playing, splashing and swishing like a child, busy cooking up some ghastly brew of water, grass and mud, which he then asserts to be soup. Yes, like a child, thought Baldini. All at once he looks like a child, despite his ungainly hands, despite his scarred, pock-marked face and his bulbous old man's nose. I took him to be older than he is, but now he seems much younger to me. He looks as if he were 3 or 4, looks just like one of those unapproachable, incomprehensible, willful little pre-human creatures who in their ostensible innocence think only of themselves, who want to subordinate the whole world to their despotic will, and would do it too if one let them pursue their megalomaniacal ways, and did not apply the strictest pedagogical principles to guide them to a disciplined, self-controlled, fully human existence. There was just such a fanatical child trapped inside this young man, standing at the table with eyes aglow, having forgotten everything around him, apparently no longer aware that there was anything else in the laboratory but himself and these bottles that he tipped into the funnel with nimble awkwardness, to mix up an insane brew that he would confidently swear, and would truly believe, to be the exquisite perfume Amor and Psyche. Baldini shuddered as he watched the fellow bustling about in the candlelight, so shockingly absurd and so shockingly self-confident. In the old days, so he thought, and for a moment he felt as sad and miserable and furious as he had that afternoon while gazing out onto the city glowing ruddy in the twilight. In the old days, people like that simply did not exist. He was an entirely new specimen of the race, one that could arise only in exhausted, dissipated times like these. But he was about to be taught his lesson, the impertinent boy. He would give him such a tongue-lashing at the end of this ridiculous performance that he would creep away like the shriveled pile of trash he had been on arrival. Vermin! One dared not get involved with anyone at all these days. The world was simply teeming with absurd vermin. Baldini was so busy with his personal exasperation and disgust at the age that he did not really comprehend what was intended when Grenouille suddenly stoppered up all the flacons, pulled the funnel out of the mixing bottle, grabbed the neck of the bottle with his right hand, capped it with the palm of his left, and shook it vigorously. Only when the bottle had been spun through the air several times, its precious contents sloshing back and forth like lemonade between belly and neck, did Baldini let loose a shout of rage and horror. "Stop it!" he screeched. "That's enough! Stop it this moment! Basta! Put that bottle back on the table, and don't touch anything else, do you understand? Nothing else! I must have been crazy to listen to your asinine gibberish. The way you handle these things, your crudity, your primitive lack of judgment, demonstrate to me that you are a bungler, a barbaric bungler, and a beastly, cheeky, snot-nosed brat besides. You wouldn't make a good lemonade mixer, not even a good licorice water vendor, let alone a perfumer. Just be glad, be grateful and content that your master lets you slop around in tanning fluids. Do not dare it ever again. Do you hear me? Do not dare ever again to set a foot across the threshold of a perfumer's shop." Thus spoke Baldini, and even as he spoke, the air around him was saturated with the odour of Amor and Psyche. Odours have a power of persuasion stronger than that of words, appearances, emotions, or will. The persuasive power of an odour cannot be fended off. It enters into us like breath into our lungs. It fills us up, imbues us totally. There is no remedy for it.